So welcome back, everybody. We now have a panel on maritime, poetics, and music. We had a taster this morning of Poetics, so very much looking forward to this. We have Dr. Chris Gray, Research Fellow at Margaret Beaufort, the lecturer in Theological Aesthetics at the London School of Theology, and of course, initiator of Maritime 1 in March last year. I wonder what Maritime 3 will be like. And Professor Kerr, who's Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Sales University, and Professor Margarita Mooney Clayton, Associate Professor in the Department of Practical Theology at Princeton Theological Seminary. Thank you all very much and welcome back.
Jacques Maritain and Flannery O'Connor, Imitation and Distortion, The Power of the Story. It's this nice story, things you hear about Flannery O'Connor, the Southern woman, writer of the grotesque freaks and so on and so forth, and ardent follower of Jacques Maritain. One of the stories I like to hear, I don't necessarily like it, but her mom used to say to Flannery, "Why can't you write the stories that people will want to read?" I can just see her saying, "Thanks, Mom." At any rate, this paper is kind of an attempt to answer this question about Flannery O'Connor's very strange stories. Many say, like the actor Ethan Hawke, director of the most recent movie on Flannery O'Connor, Wildcat, it's really good, that you either love her stories or you hate them. People ask, why do American Southern writers write about freaks? O'Connor replies, it's because we see them. I propose here to offer some philosophical clues that might be helpful in understanding her work and appreciating what she's doing. Where to begin? Well, we can begin where she began. And she tells us in her letters that she cut her aesthetic teeth on art and scholasticism. That is, on the aesthetics of the Thomas Jacques Maritain. She had the J.F. Scanlon translation of the second edition of Maritain's first major aesthetic work. According to E. Jane During and Ruth Ann Knetchel Johansson, the two thinkers to whom O'Connor refers most frequently in her essays and in her letters about art, artist, reality, and mystery are St. Thomas Aquinas and Jacques Maritain. Upon reading the latter, she became convinced of many of the truths of his aesthetic principles, and they became foundational for her. Now, it's good to remember, and it was mentioned today already, that St. Thomas did not have an aesthetic theory, but Maritain did. And he saw himself as adapting the principles of St. Thomas Aquinas and the schoolmen to forge one, put something together. The key to Maritain's theory is the idea that art is a virtue or habitus of the practical intellect. That's been said quite a bit. It's founded upon reasoning, and that the good at which art, reason in making, aims is none other than the work itself. And that art begins where human knowledge begins, with the senses. But at the same time, it must involve the whole person, conscious and pre-conscious. She upholds Maritain's and St. Thomas's criteria of beauty, and she says to fearful writers, that they should have their strict attention to the order, proportion, and radiance of what they are making. It's all based on the formal qualities of the work of art. Now, despite what some readers might suspect, her art is not primarily a critique of Southern religious customs. They're part of the landscape, not the subject matter. She worked within the culture and the environment and the manners of the Christ-haunted South. Okay, that's very important for her. You were talking before about location, about area, so situation. You get the eternal from the local, in a sense, and really to master that. For her works, we find freaks such as Hazel Motes, the central character in Wise Blood, preaching the Church of God without Christ. And A Good Man is hard to find. That was the short story that made her reputation. We Fear the Killer on the Loose is called The Misfit. We also fear for the self-centered grandmother as we experience the distortions of these characters. What comes through is not an explanation for preaching or religious practices, but the spiritual qualities within and around fallen human beings and the decisions they face concerning their acceptance or the rejection of the grace of God. It is the inside of things that are most real, important, and permanent. And these insides are on the outside of their characters, where we can see them. The wooden lead of Holga, okay, in Good Country People. There's Angela Stanford, author, claims there's a medieval influence here. And since O'Connor thinks that humans are fallen creatures and distorted on the inside, she will display this out on the outside where we can see this. O'Connor repeatedly says that she knows that her audience will not easily follow her. She knows that they're largely participants in a secular humanism that sees all of reality as being pretty near the surface of things. And they suspect that all of the greatest of human ideals, powers, and mysteries of the human being will eventually evaporate under the sciences. Daniel Dennett once said, for example, that evolutionary theory was like an acid. It burns through everything. But for O'Connor, the human person is a mystery. It's intelligible, but beyond full comprehension. And this mystery will never disappear under the scientific gaze. So how do you write for the person who thinks everything's physical? Well, in the first place for O'Connor, if you're going to be a good writer, you got to work with the physical and in the physical and how it appears. And you've got to be faithful to that. On the other hand, you're not going to be a prisoner of appearances. You're not going to take these physical appearances as the last word about what's fully real. You're not going to show freaks and violent acts for their own sake or for the sake of the contemporary nihilism, although some readers did suspect her of nihilism. You're going to try to get to what O'Connor calls the texture of existence. Following her mentor, Maritain, art and poetry attempt to reach out and explore the existential and spiritual aspects of things, including the tremendous realities of human freedom, motivation, inclination, sympathies, desires, aspirations. Okay, these are critical. Okay? So, for O'Connor, we're fallen. And so, in one sense, we're already spiritually freakish in a way. But we've grown to be seeing ourselves and others as natural. So the writer must distort what he or she sees in order to get beyond the appearances and to reveal the inner truth about the characters. I think it's like the Socratic method in Elenchus, but one that's artistically done. And just as Socrates begins with the other and what they try to define, so we too, the artists, must begin with the world, what we sense to be true, and then we must distort. Do you mind object to this point? Isn't she free? Isn't she distorting things? Isn't she falsifying what she's seeing? Why can't we complain with her mom, Regina? She should be writing another Gone with the Wind, you know. She should be at least uplifting us, inspiring us. Shouldn't we expect that from Catholic authors? When we make requests like these, we have the underlying presumption that the story is supposed to be true to life and be uplifting and full of good feelings. This would be imitating the world. But for O'Connor, this simple, uplifting story tends to falsify the way the world actually is. It whitewashes it. It doesn't give us the whole picture. The world has good and evil in it. Both have to be acknowledged. Thus, like a prophet, when she's through with us, we might not like what we see in her world and in ourselves. Sometimes she didn't like seeing what she found in herself. Okay? But she doesn't want us to leave out half or 3/4 of the facts of human existence. Okay, and one time she talked about Cardinal Spellman's novel, The Foundling, which was one of those uplifting, always feel good kind of things. And she said he left out 3/4 to 1/2 of what the human existence feels like. Okay, so still the word distortion occurs no less than 11 times throughout her collected prose on fiction, mystery, and manners, it's called, indicating distortion was an idea that was very important to her. Still, it's an odd idea. The idea that a story telling us something true about reality, or at least resonating with it, you'd say, well, aren't people who are distorting going the other way? Aren't they telling lies? Aren't they bending the tale to their own ends? Okay, this brings up the idea, what is imitation? What should that be about? Well, I'm going to claim that O'Connor really follows Jacques Maritain's view of imitation as found in art scholasticism and in creative intuition, although we don't have any evidence, I don't have any evidence that she had read the latter. So I stick with the second version of art scholasticism, the Scanlon, which has been reprinted, by the way, by Clooney. It's a very nice edition. Okay. Well, Maritain in Creative Intuition says of imitation, the word is hopelessly wrong. It's misleading. It's unhappy. We sense there are problems here. We're going to need some serious distinctions. Maritain asks himself, is pain supposed to imitate reality? If so, what keeps it from being trompe-l'oeil? Gilson really rejected the idea of imitation on this very, very ground. Okay. Maritain wrote in the second edition of Art and Scholasticism that the reproduction or exact copy of nature thus appears as an object of impossible pursuit, a concept which vanishes when an attempt is made to define it. Okay, that's imitation. But you might ask, what's left? How does imitation work? Maritain tells us, in reality, it's not a question of slavishly imitating an object, but what is entirely different, of manifest with utmost fidelity at the cost of every distortion, which may be necessary, the form or ray of intelligibility, the brilliance of which is apprehended in the real. Thus, transformation, which owes its simplicity to spiritual fidelity, to the form shining in things and their profound light. All this is necessary. Okay, so that's important. Maritain adds, you can find these in the masters and the greatest of them all, Rembrandt. There can be transformations, distortions, abbreviations, redispositions. So Maritain will ultimately say, such a genuine concept of imitation in creative intuition affords a ground and justification for the boldest kinds of transposition, transfiguration, deformation, recasting of natural appearances, so far as they are a means to make the work manifest intuitively the transparent reality which has been grasped by the artist. Okay, so that's Maritain. But one time you see, how does Flannery O'Connor respond to this? How does she go about this? Well, in Mystery and Manners, she talks about Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis. She says this is a story about a man who wakes up one morning to find out he's been turned into a cockroach overnight. While not disregarding human nature, discarding human nature, the fact that this story describes the dual nature of man in such a realistic fashion, it's almost unbearable. The truth is not distorted here, but rather a certain distortion is used to get at the truth. If we admit, as we must, that the appearance is not the same thing as reality, we're not going to agree with the secular humanists, right? Then we must give the artist the liberty to make certain rearrangements of nature. This is her, and this will lead to greater depths of vision. I think that's really interesting. So we're not just about the skin and bones of people. We're not just about neurons and brains, the natural appearances. We want to take that plunge. One person had said to her, "It must be easy being a novelist, a short story writer." And she says here, writing a novel is a terrible experience during which the hair often falls out and the teeth decay. I'm highly irritated by people who imply that writing fiction is an escape from reality. It's a plunge into reality, and it's very shocking to the system. And that's what it's all about. And I'll end with this line here, okay? End with this one line. Okay. If I can turn off my phone. All right, which is that I think if you think about the most beautiful, amazing thing in the cosmos that we know about, it'd be the human soul, that thing that decides and chooses and thinks and aspires and all that kind of stuff. Imagine if we could see another human soul. We'd be in awe. It'd be the most amazing thing. Well, I want to say that's sort of like what O'Connor's about, trying to see what's going on with the human soul. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Just a quick note. As the conference began to take shape, it became apparent that the proceedings were being ordered and shaped and evolved around the divine office and mass tonight and music and that. So I took the liberty of changing the title of my paper accordingly. So it's not what's on the program, but it's what's on the website. So the title, what I'm going to speak about, is called Maritain, Jones, and Ratzinger on Art and Liturgy. In 1941, in an article titled Religion and the Muses, David Jones wrote the following: "It is often remarked with a certain amount of perplexity that the modern artist, though he be a Catholic and of sensitivity and ability at his work, seems nonetheless to be not at his happiest when required to do a job closely connected with the liturgical life of the Church." This wry observation by a noted contemporary and disciple of Jacques Maritain calls into question Maritain's incitement to shelter the prayer, instruct the intelligence, and rejoice the eyes and the soul. The mission of the artist, it would seem to Jones, is all well and good, except when it concerns liturgical art. How many of us have ever felt likewise? In preserving the distinctions between art and liturgy, tensions naturally arise. The aim of art is beauty, and the aim of liturgy is worship. But human creativity is often set against the apparent strictures of the liturgy, which is God's work, and in which God himself sacramentally acts first. There are historical moments when those tensions have manifested acutely and frequently where music is concerned. In what follows, I shall briefly draw together the ostensibly unlikely pairing of Jacques Maritain and Joseph Ratzinger alongside David Jones, who, as I see it, authenticates the mission of the artist in the modern era with unprecedented authority. All three very different characters articulate complementary principles which may help to re-enchant the disenchanted. So, 1. Liturgy as archetype. Maritain's depiction of liturgy flows from a life shaped around the prayer of the Church. Reading his slender volume, Prayer and Intelligence, one immediately senses a profound attachment to the Mass and the divine office. It's no surprise, then, to discover a liturgical thread woven through his aesthetics, and it begins, as we've discovered so many times today, with his revolutionary early text, Art and Scholasticism. "Consider the liturgy," he writes. "It is the transcendent and supereminent type of the forms of Christian art. The Spirit of God in person fashioned it so as to be able to delight in it." Maritain declares that liturgy is archetypal. It is a divinely ordered supreme paradigm for the diverse forms and patterns of human art, all of which aspire to emulate liturgical action in some degree. The aesthetic quality of the liturgy underpins this depiction, and Maritain infers that art and liturgy, whilst being necessarily distinguishable, are nonetheless ordered to unity because they have a prior familial likeness. This original unity witnesses to a living tradition, the spirit of which endures and arises at different times, in different places, and in different liturgic or artistic guises. In the clearest cases, it emerges in the language, music, and art of the church, and in the finest secular art, which Maritain daringly portrays as already Christian in hope. As he says, the liturgy is not entirely immutable. It suffers the passage of time, but crucially, that eternity rejuvenates itself in it. Ditto art. Whatever forms the highest artistic achievements refer us back to an essential liturgic ancestry, either overtly or indirectly, as an echo of the mother art, so to speak. The trajectory of Western music is a case in point, providing outstanding examples in every era of its development. Maritain particularly reveres Gregorian chant, accepting it as a divinely authored yet humanly uttered form of song, which has afforded liturgical preeminence. Of course, its ancestry can be traced back through the ages to that proto-liturgy of lyrical poems, the Psalms, which, as Joseph Ratzinger notes, becomes the prayer book of the infant church, which, with equal spontaneity, has become the church that sings her prayers. Liturgy as an archetype has a long history. But Maritain goes further in relating the song of the church to the creation of art. Gregorian melody, for him, becomes the spiritual and often literal archetype of all melody. In a number of works, he draws our attention to a profound sense in which a melodic line discloses realities and truths about its creator in ways that other musical elements do not. Melody is, if you will, the transcendent hallmark or signature of the composer, the confession of who he is. Accordingly, the realities of the divine liturgy are more than just an analogous for artistic form and creation. They are more than just an inspiration. They are the archetype. In creative intuition in art and poetry, Maritain develops a rich ontology and epistemology of artistry itself, and he doesn't refer directly to liturgy. However, and it's a big one, the entire work is premised on the person as artist emerging in a fresh way at the incarnation and evolving in stages over the centuries in response to the sacred exemplar of Christ's divine self. Certainly, with the passage of time, the human person, the creative individual, comes increasingly into the foreground, but the archetype can never fully be erased. Throughout his writing in aesthetics, Maritain demands that a work of art should be more than just a choice ingredient in the presentation of something else. He asks for art with all its teeth. If music is created to serve the liturgy, it must adhere to the inner foundations of the liturgical texts, not subordinated to their content, but cooperating on equal terms. Equally, those texts must penetrate the creative intuition of the artist, but emerge unscathed, i.e., liturgy with all its teeth. It is expected that art and liturgy should be brought into harmonious coexistence. This underscores, I think, the message of Sacrosanctum Concilium, which states of the music of the church, as sacred song united to the words, it forms a necessary or integral part of the solemn liturgy. United, necessary, integral. Maritain's message is this: artistic creation does not copy God's creation, but continues it. This is to say, a good work of art seeks not to replicate and recall God's perfect handiwork in a naturalistic sense. No, it is an echo, faint or strong, of its liturgical parent, and exists only to serve the religious end from which it owes its existence. 2. Liturgy and Logos. For Maritain, it is given that the liturgy is a received reality, and as a philosopher, he largely leaves alone questions about its inner theological foundation. Joseph Ratzinger's masterwork, The Spirit of the Liturgy, is thus an ideal point of contact, and the section on art and music seems especially pertinent here. Ratzinger is preoccupied with the fundamental character and coherence of the liturgy, and his treatment of music as it relates to the great prayer of the Church is biblical and Christological. He frequently draws our attention to those historical tensions where artistic freedom began to assert itself to the potential detriment of right doctrine, and he points to various resolutions. At the center of the relationship between art and liturgy, between music and words, is the divine logos, the eternal word, cosmic words. In fact, the relationship that exists between word as language and the word as logos provides an outstanding incentive for the music of Christian worship. Because the word towers over everything that exists, it should be the foremost stimulus to the creative consciousness, even as we rely on the normative biblical and liturgical texts. The sacred song which flows forth will be, in Ratzinger's words, a higher form of proclamation. If this is the yardstick for the creative artist, then it really is not only plain chant which submits its art to the ends of divine worship. The inspired creation of new works is mandated. There is, too, a sense in which the relationship between language and the word as logos takes advantage of music's natural tendency to transfigure and transcend speech. It's a familiar trait, but drawn into the logos and made present to us as a gift of the Holy Spirit, this trait is elevated in the highest possible way. Ratzinger states, he enkindles love in us, and thus moves us to sing. Words are superseded, but not the word, the logos. Music already exhibits a higher, more spiritual liberation from the material world, and also from language. But now this very quality, so perplexing to ancients and moderns alike, is given a definitive purpose. Music created for the liturgy has fulfilled its natural inclination when it is a music in harmony with logos, or logos-worthy worship, as Ratzinger says. A third point concerns creator and creation itself, and it draws a line back to Maritain view of the liturgy. All the theories of antiquity about the cosmic origins of music are revised in light of the logos as creator of everything, in whom, as Ratzinger notes, are contained the archetypes of the world's order, and who creates in accordance with those archetypes. Human art seeks to conform to the work of the original artist. He says, to Christ, to the mind of the creator. So it is doubly significant, then, when art is turned to the liturgy, which, as we recall, Maritain termed the archetype of all art. Ratzinger's message is heartening. True artistic freedom is not curtailed, but enlarged in proportion to the degree that our making is cosmic in scope and ambition. The aesthetic virtues aspire and point to a final unity with theological truth, because in the Christian era, that's where they began. Their growth was, and still could be, chaperoned by a life lived liturgically. 3. Liturgy and artist. I cannot escape the sense that both Maritain and Ratzinger remain somewhat at arm's length from the coalface of artistic production. Actually, the trenches would be a better metaphor given the individual we return to. Soldier, engraver, poet, painter, David Jones occupies a unique place in 20th century British art. In 1955, Jones dealt with his own perplexity regarding the situation of the modern artist and the church. His astounding treatise, Art and Sacrament, is a complex blend of the speculative and the practical, and goes further than Chesterton in asserting that the human person is uniquely and foremost a sign-making, religious, and sacramental being. Jones corroborates Maritain's reflections on art, but without elevating any particular art or even fine art as typical. He also anticipates the theological obligation to reconcile the person of the artist with the spirit of the liturgy, especially as it points to the Eucharist. Here's what he says. Art is, at bottom, an inescapably religious activity, for it deals with realities, and the real is sacred and religious. From the beginning, humanity signifies its very existence in the realms of making and acting, of putting things together well and doing right things. a creature of ingenuity and a creature of faith and morals, given to art and bound to prudence. For Jones, this is what it means to be human, and in the realm of art there are defining qualities which follow from this. Creation itself, he suggests, was an entirely gratuitous act, which the human artist powerfully reflects. The creative act is inevitable and habitual in the way of fulfilling a natural need, and it is completely unnecessary, a thing denied to animals and angels, as Jones puts it. It is gratuitous. It is also intransitive, that is to say, the process of forming, of achieving fittingness, and aiming for perfection is entirely non-functional, whatever the aims or ends of that making. In fact, as Jones states, art is the sole intransitive activity of man. But the greatest trait comes into view as the work goes out of itself to reveal or signify some external aspect. The intransitive becomes transitive, as a definite object is recalled, represented, and shown forth again under other forms. You can see where Jones is going. Signification is the behavior of the human person since primitive times, and this points inextricably to the truth that sacramentum at root is also something radical and inescapable. It is ultimately impossible to ignore the institution of sign as sacrament in the Christian tradition and the centrality of those events in human history. Sacrament is neither an optional extra nor a concession to our corporeal state. It is inherent to it. The most powerful observation Jones makes is also the most devastatingly logical. The upper room event in which the supereminent signs were instituted by the Lord looms over us, and it changed art forever. But why? Jones tells us. It would appear to me, he says, impossible that at the redemption of the world, anything should have been done which committed man to any activity not utterly inalienable from his nature. In such a context, the extraneous is inconceivable. Signs were employed by our Lord, he says, by virtue of the doer being a man along with us, more explicitly by his being man, the artist, along with us. Each in their own way, Maritain, Ratzinger, and Jones confirm that the Christian faith is deeply and unmistakably committed to art in a powerful and essential manner. I've always wondered at the number of artists of little or no religious commitment who have nonetheless adorned the liturgy in beautiful works. I can only surmise from what has just been outlined and more besides that the truth of what is apprehended in the creative minds of such individuals is just too overwhelming to ignore. So, to close this quickfire and far too dense three-part manifesto, yes, art is ordered to beauty and liturgy to worship, but the person as artist is already conformed to liturgical art. And as Aquinas anyway reminds us, the beauty of God is the cause of the being of all that exists. Now there's an incentive. The modern artist of sensitivity and ability, composer or otherwise, is liberated to shelter the prayer, instruct the intelligence, and rejoice the mind and the soul, and to be at his or her happiest, doing it in the service of the liturgy. Thank you.
Okay, so I will try to reduce my 15 pages of single-spaced text into less than 10 minutes using some art and some stories to pull out some of the main points of what I've written. So I wanted to explain the revised title of my paper, From Strangers to Friends, the Arts as Formative and Expressive. But first, I'll tell you that this picture here, this piece of art, is from the Maritain's home in Princeton, where I live. For many years, I have done little pilgrimages outside of the home, hoping one day I'd get in. And by the intervention of some angel or prayer, just before coming over here for this conference, I did actually meet the owners and I went in. And you can look at my blog, The Grace to Imagination, and see all the pictures, the art that they commissioned. But I will just point out that this is the River Seine. It's obviously Paris, it's where they're from. It has a modern tone, and it represents something of their hometown of Paris. And I teach in the Princeton Theological Seminary, just to put my remarks in context. I teach in a department called Practical Theology, and I'm in the field that they call Christian education. Princeton Theological Seminary, in case you don't know, grew out of the Reformed Presbyterian tradition. And so we just heard about liturgy. Their liturgy has music, but would not have a lot of visual art. And so I'm often speaking to students for whom these larger questions about beauty and the arts and Christian formation, they don't have a lot of direct experience or theological knowledge of a lot of the themes that we're talking about here. And so I assigned a piece called about whether or not music as formative and expressive, from a Protestant scholar, John Whitfield. And one student came up to me afterward and he said, you know, I am a musical performer in the Protestant church, and the dominant ethos really is one of expression. The artist is expressing something spiritual and creating an experience for others in order to be able to experience God. And of course, there's something good about that. But he said for himself, as an excellent performer, he feels this tension because as a musician for the church, the expectation is that the more perfect the performance on a human level, the closer it is to being from God. But he knows there's something wrong with that, because to be a musician is not simply to be a performer, to be a humanly perfect performance, which arouses people to a kind of emotional state. And so he was grappling with some of these larger questions that I was presenting, that we've heard so much about here today, to understand his vocation to make music for the church. And so, because I'm in Princeton and my students are too, I share a little bit of the Maritan's own biography. So that's where the second part of this title comes from, is from strangers to friends, because many of the students who I'm teaching perceive that the arts have potentially, at least, a great capacity for the life of the church today, congregations, but also outreach ministries, to bring kind of a desperate need to evangelize a largely secularized and dark culture, and to bring hope and beauty and a vision of the real where grace prevails over violence and unity prevails over dissipation. So they're looking to the arts and to artists to give them a way to have people experience that presence of God and lead them to the truths of the faith. And I talk about the Maritans because we've heard a lot, of course, about them today, but so these are sort of some of the questions that I talk about in my classes, but the title From Strangers to Friends, the subtitle of this paper, I took from the biography of the Maritans, which recounts how the Maritans really, as converts to Christianity, had experienced this utter sense of strangeness in this world that led them to the brink of despair and philosophical nihilism and potentially to suicide. But that through their conversion to Catholicism, which happened through their encounter with poets and through the arts, they discovered a way of embracing the strangeness of the world, but having hope, because we are capable of this incredible intimacy, this friendship with God. And so I try to communicate to my students that we can acknowledge, as we heard in the last panel and our earlier presentations, we can acknowledge the strangeness of the world while affirming the goodness of it and our capacity to uplift and to bring something good out of what even appears to be the ashes of a civilization, because this was the Maritans' personal journey. So the sections of my paper, by the way, this is also more art from the Maritans' home. It was done by the artist André Girard. It's like a Parisian, all these Parisian scenes. So in the structure of my paper, I briefly go through the Maritans' conversion and the importance of the arts in their religious conversion. Maritain the Thomist, we've heard a lot about today, because I think it's important to clarify that, of course, he was a Thomist, because it's possible in a secular context to pick out pieces of his work, especially from creative intuition and art and poetry, as if he were speaking as a romantic, which I do not think would be a correct interpretation, because we've heard much about that today. Maritain the art critic, I think that's present in creative intuition and art and poetry. But what I thought I'd share with you today, because we haven't heard it, the piece of my paper that is different than what we've heard today, is Maritain's writing about the arts in his very short and excellent book, on education at the crossroads. And I want to use some of his ideas from his work on education to develop what I call a tentative thesis of the vocation of the artist, which I think is consistent with what Maritain says, but also John Paul II's letter to artists. Don't worry, I'll put my tentative thesis up on a slide later, but basically my thesis is that the vocation of an artist is to develop the habitus, that is, the practical virtues of the intellect, in order to direct their inspirations, to make beautiful things that convey the spiritual heritage of the nation and the civilization, and to inspire others to contemplate God. Now, that's a long definition and it pulls from all of his work, but I'll try to explain how I got there, in particular from his work on education. So in his book, Education at the Crossroads, he talks about music as being a part of the liberal arts. And he talks about music necessitating discipline, virtue, and being tied to holiness. Now, he also, as a good Thomist, talks about the experience of music. He says that it's necessary to make clear that the understanding of the pupil, the inner logic of a Mozart sonata, to be read and discussed from the score. But it is first necessary for the pupil to hear the sonata and be delighted in it, and love it with his ears and with his heart. And again, he's upholding here the role of the senses, because he says man's senses are not that impure element which Puritanism abhorred. He's saying this, by the way, giving a lecture in New Haven, Connecticut, which was a Puritan colony. It's not very puritanical anymore. But he says our senses are not unworthy of reason. Our senses serve reason and convey its food to it. And why is this important? Because all throughout Education at the Crossroads, he's emphasizing the inner dynamism of the student is the end of education, not the mastery of a particular set of skills or even knowledge, but the cultivation of the inner dynamism of the student himself is the end of education. And if we forget that principle, Maritain fears that we turn upside down the natural and vital tendency of the mind. So we are not meant to turn education into simply mental training, because that neglects the ultimate end of man, which is the contemplative part, which then feeds the practical action in the world. Again, he's not separating, again, he's a Thomist, he's not separating the contemplative from the practical. They're united, but we cannot turn education merely into a practical tool. Neither can we turn the arts purely into something practical or technical, purely that. The arts should delight us and turn our intelligence to questions, to understanding the world better. So he says, for example, that the goal of a liberal education should be to lead the student's intelligence to follow in the intellectual virtues, which in fact are the real merit of the artist. The artist's merit is in the virtues that have created the work. So what he wants students to learn is that by imitating these intellectual virtues of the artist, whether you're an artist or not, they can also become co-creators and endow the world with meaning and beauty and delight. Now, Maritain's definition of the end of education, I wanted to point out that he says the end of education is to foster this internal dynamism of the student in order to preserve and extend the knowledge and the spiritual heritage, this is his words, the spiritual heritage of the nation and of civilization in order to contribute to the common good. So the reason I think that is important, and I now want to just, in the few minutes I have left, I'm cutting my paper very short, but I want to speak a little bit about why Maritain is such an important interlocutor for me to try to present to my students the theology and the vocation of the artist. In a review essay by the pianist Jeremy Begbie, who's also a professor of theology at Duke, he traces, I think, very beautifully the theological changes and understanding of the arts, in particular in certain realms of Protestant theology, which are current in the places where I teach, in which this idea of the human co-creating with God has really sort of been lost. He specifically talks about how in the classical understanding of art, which is mostly what we've heard today, the classical and the medieval, humans are actually co-creating with God, using their intelligence to further the work of the divine. And so I put up this picture here of St. Luke painting the Virgin and Child to emphasize the reality of the incarnation and the classical and the medieval understanding that the arts, the fine arts and the creation of art was understood as an extension of the act of the incarnation, right? Elevating, as we heard from Father Brad Elliott, elevating the created order towards the infinite. Begbie says that this classical and medieval understanding in theology began to split with the Protestant Reformation. And the human, the connection between the human and the divine, and then he kind of moves forward quickly into Karl Barth's understanding of Christology, where he says that the human and the divine are somehow ontologically related, but the chasm is so big that to speak of human action as kind of co-creating with the divine is almost unspeakable. And the emphasis becomes on what my student said, the human perfection in the art, but not as an extension of the incarnation. And so Begbie says this is why, now the next step down from that is what I think we hear a lot in popular culture outside of theological circles, and something that Maritain was very concerned about and very critical of. The vocation of the artist, then, outside of the theological circles, but in the modern world, the artist himself is the priest and the prophet, and expressing not only their subjectivity anymore, as in Romanticism, but the collective spirit of the image. And so Begbie traces these theological differences in the understanding of the incarnation and co-creation with God as opening up to actually a collapse of Romanticism and a self-expression of the artist, and opening up the darkness and the absurdity of the created order in forms of nihilism and surrealism, while at the same time elevating that kind of art as having a vocation to express the collective spirit of the age, which we look at and call dark and absurd. And the point I make to my students, and it's very clear in the biography of Maritain, was that the Maritains could accept a world full of pain and suffering, but not absurdity and meaninglessness. So I also just briefly want to say, turning to John Paul II and his letter to artists from 1999, a man who lived under much of the darkness of communism and the denial of the transcendent, and his own kind of Catholic faith and its expression in theater and the art, and his I think extremely important call to the importance of the arts to show the image of God, to convey the beauty and the goodness, and also just to make this point that artists need the church as much as the church needs the art. That artists have a vocation to be in the world, to create material objects in the world, objects of fine arts, in a way that the preaching of the gospel can become clearer to the human mind. So art can be a kind of evangelization, or at least a complement to it. He calls artists as having a noble ministry. The church needs literary figures, artists, musicians, architects to express the ineffable. And the artists need the church to support them in their vocation for holiness. And the Maritains knew this, which is why they had the Thomistic circles, which is why in their home in Princeton, they had artists, they had Albert Einstein, they had a kind of spirituality of accompaniment of many artists, which I think is maybe why sometimes Maritain is thought of as promoting the art of Rouault, let's say, as the right kind of art. I'm not so sure he's promoting Rouault's art Or is he promoting the journey of the inner person as being extremely important and wanting to respect that responsibility of the artist in his vocation to holiness? I would like to interpret it as that, because I don't actually find the art form to be expressing what I think would be a better expression of art. But that's another conversation. But this kind of spirituality of accompaniment was extremely important to the Maritans to help artists to further their own vocation to holiness, because as we've heard, that will influence their art, but it's also going to influence the culture around them via their art. So I will just finish by putting up by the way, that picture is also from the Maritain home. It is the tile on their floor. And I took a picture of it because it's an abstract geometrical form, which he says in creative intuition and art and poetry, you can do abstract art through geometrical form. And if you want these pictures, they are on my blog, The Graced Imagination. But my thesis, or perhaps my tentative thesis, I'm open to revising it, is that the vocation of the artist, as I said, is to develop the habitus, the practical virtues of the intellect, to direct their inspirations, right? That intelligence is directing those inspirations to make beautiful things. I initially stopped there. Sounds kind of obvious. So I added the second part, perhaps to open up a larger discussion. That the things the artists make convey, as he says in Education at the Crossroads at the end of education, the things that artists make convey the spiritual heritage of the nation and the civilization, and focusing on the reception, right, inspire others to contemplate God. I put that in there because of the dynamism between the person and the collective, which I think is extremely important, and the potential that artists have not to be revered themselves as priests or performers, but in the context of the church and in the context of evangelization, to give things that delight our senses, such so that we are moved not to delight in the performer, but to delight in God. Thank you.